So let's get back into what happened during the time of paperclip and during the time of, you know, the atomic bomb, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what really went on back then, because I think a lot of people need to get their history, you know, straightened out in their heads.
They really do, because, you know, in our conventional history, it's like, well, there was the Russian Revolution, and then out of that grew communism, and then we had a Cold War with them versus capitalism, and yada yada yada. The truth of the matter is that the very same people in Wall Street and the City of London, these internationalists, these global financiers, they created communism in Russia. When the Russian Revolution broke out, Lenin was in Switzerland. Trotsky was in New York living on Rockefeller property. Okay, they sent them into Russia to capture the revolution for the Bolsheviks and turn Russia into a communist state, which they did. Okay, and the idea was, I think, was to build up a communist East versus a capitalist West, and they were going to perpetuate the Cold War many years before we saw it actually come into being. But the problem was it threatened to get out of hand. There were strong communist parties in France, England, Italy, Germany, even the United States. And so we talk about this one world government, but they really don't want a true one world government, because then they can't play one nation off against another or one economic bloc off against another. So this made them fearful, and they decided they had to stop the spread of communism. So the one country that was in a position geographically and economically to act as a bloc against the spread of communism was Germany. So they went in and found a German army intelligence agent, and they put him in charge of a little political party called the German Workers' Party, which he quickly changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, the acronym of which is Nazi. And of course that was Adolf Hitler. And Hitler provided this block against the spread of communism, and then they perpetrated this whole idea of the Nazis were bitter enemies of the communists, okay?
And meanwhile, they're being financed by
and run
Bush,
by the same people.
Prescott Bush behind
exactly.
the scenes.
Yeah, and the Rockefellers.
And what is it, Farben?
I.G. Farben.
I.G. Farben.
And the head of I.G. Farben was Herman Schmitz, and Herman Schmitz owned as much Standard Oil stock as John D. Rockefeller did. It was all the same international globalist, if you will. Now the problem is that Hitler got too strong, and the Germans were a little too efficient, and they overran Europe. They were moving into North Africa. They were pushing into Russia, taking over Norway, and were threatening Britain. And now all of a sudden it looked like they were going to have a one-world national socialist system. Well, they didn't want that either, but mostly they didn't want Germany in charge of the world economic order, because this had been the purview of the City of London, those bankers with the Bank of England, and their Wall Street compadres, okay? So at some point, even though they had created Hitler, put him into power, financed his rise, they turned against him, and that's when we had World War II. And they managed to stop Germany, push it back, and yes, we defeated Germany in World War II, but we didn't defeat the Nazis, because the Nazis were still much in power, and they cut deals. They swapped their exotic technology, their rocket technology, their energy manipulation technology, their mind control technology, chemical and technology, and pharmaceutical technology to the United States in exchange for immunity. And we brought them in over the war. And in the late 40s and early 50s, John J. McCloy, who had been head of National City Bank, which was one of the largest lenders of money to pre-World War II Nazi Germany, was made High Commissioner of Germany, and he pardoned thousands of unreconstructed Nazis, brought them over to the United States. His protege was Allen Dulles, who then was head of the CIA for many years, and under Dulles, he whitewashed their backgrounds and put them all, these Nazis, into our military-industrial complex. And that began the National Socialist infiltration of the United States system.
Wow, that's an excellent summation of really what happened behind the scenes. And this is what most people don't know.
No, you're never
about
taught
American
this in
history,
school. Right.
and even the history of the world. So you also could talk about what the Nazis had by virtue of their occult investigations and possibly even channeling, and how they got what is in essence free energy, maybe even Stargate technology, certainly UFOs.
Exotic technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the question has always been, how did the Nazis get so far ahead of us in science?
Exactly.
They were broadcasting the 1936 Berlin Olympics over television. In fact, by the end of the war, they had television-guided missiles. Holy cow, we didn't know that. And there's good reason to believe they actually possessed and had tested a nuclear weapon. But by the time they did not have a reliable delivery system, and by the time they were ready to maybe unleash a nuclear weapon, it was spring of 1945, and the Russians were closing in from the east and the Allies from the west, and it was almost all over. And if they had set off an atomic bomb somewhere, it would not have ended the war. It would have simply meant the total devastation and destruction of Germany. Now, where did they get all this? For years, I'd heard stories that, well, they captured a flying saucer somewhere and they back-engineered it. But yet, every time you try to track those stories, it never went anywhere. And I am now of the opinion, based on information that I have now and based on documentation that has come out of the old Soviet Union now with the collapse of communism, that the Germans had their own remote viewers. Of course, they didn't call it remote viewing because that was a term that was coined back when the CIA and the National Security Agency in this country was studying and working with psychic warfare. But they had the same type thing. Back then, the Germans had been very much involved in the occult, if you want to call it that, all the way back in prior to the 1920s. And they would have seances, and they would have all of these channelings, or whatever you want to call it. But at the bottom line of it is what we call remote viewing. It was the use of the psychic abilities. And
this is the Vril Society, wasn't it?
The Vril Society, and this was largely based on the philosophies of Madame Blavatsky and her Theosophical Society. They were heavy into that, and of course Hitler was put into power with the help of the Thule-Gesellschaft, or the Thule Society, which was an occult society made up of some of the wealthiest and aristocrats there in Germany and industrialists. And they were big into this stuff, into spiritualism, I think is what they called it back then. And so they, according to the information I have, there was even a unit within the German military called Dr. Greenbaum. And this was basically their remote viewers. And interestingly enough, this was under a broader umbrella program called MAGIC, M-A-J-I-K. And that's really interesting because, as you well know, the Majestic 12 or Magic 12 that's always talked about in the UFO literature being the people at the top who are in charge of the secrecy over UFO technology was MAJIC 12 to begin with, which is the anglicized version of MAJIK, the German version. And I'm wondering if perhaps when we brought their mind control experts and their pharmaceutical experts and their rocket scientists all over here after the war, if we didn't bring some of their psychic scientists too.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, what about, I mean, Vannevar Bush, he was head of Majestic 12, and, you know, that was set up by the Truman, supposedly set up by the Truman administration, right, to handle the problem of UFOs and what it meant to America. But that's a very interesting trail to follow if they already were in operation in Germany.